What happened to the missing girls in the woods? Is there an ancient evil lurking in the shadows, and will the police be able to uncover the truth before it's too late? Stay tuned for spine-chilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe now to join us on this terrifying journey. I never believed in the supernatural. My life was rooted in facts, figures and evidence. A small-town police officer in the late 1980s, I prided myself on being the rock of rationality and a sea of superstition. But one case changed everything. My name is Ethan Mercer, and this story starts with a missing person report on a warm autumn evening in 1987, the kind of evening where the sun cast long shadows, and the air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke. I was at my desk working through a stack of paperwork when the phone rang. "Mercer, you there?" It was Joe, my partner. His voice had an edge to it, something I hadn't heard in a long time. "Yeah, Joe, what's up?" "We've got a missing girl, Katie Hammond, 16 years old. Parents say she didn't come home last night." Missing persons weren't uncommon, especially teenagers. They usually turned up within a day or two, having spent the night at a friend's house or sneaking off with a boyfriend. But something about Joe's tone told me this was different. "I'll be right there." I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The Hammond house was on the outskirts of town, an old farmhouse surrounded by thick woods, the kind of place where you could feel completely isolated, even though you were only a few miles from the nearest neighbor. Mr. and Mrs. Hammond were beside themselves with worry. Mrs. Hammond was a mess of tears, clutching a worn-out handkerchief, while Mr. Hammond stood rigid, his face a mask of controlled panic. She was supposed to be home by 9. Mr. Hammond said, his voice strained. "She never misses curfew." "Did she mention where she was going?" I asked. "Just to the library to study for her history test." Mrs. Hammond sobbed. "She always tells us where she's going." Joe and I exchanged a glance. The library was a 10-minute walk from the Hammond's house, and the librarian confirmed Katie had been there until closing time at 8:30. After that the trail went cold. We decided to start a search in the woods surrounding the Hammond property. A few volunteers from town joined us, flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The woods were thick, with gnarled trees and underbrush. That made progress slow. As we moved deeper into the forest, a sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't just the darkness, or the task at hand. It was something more. The woods were eerily silent, devoid of the usual night sounds. No crickets, no owls, just the crunch of our footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig over here. Joe's shout broke the silence. We hurried to his side and found a small clearing. In the center there was a circle of stones, black, and by what looked like an old fire. Scattered around were bits of fabric that looked like they belonged to Katie's clothes. "Looks like someone was here," Joe said, kneeling to examine the ground. "But where are they now?" A shiver ran down my spine as I scanned the trees. Something didn't feel right. We decided to call it a night and resume the search. In the morning, as we walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next day we expanded the search, bringing in more volunteers and even a couple of bloodhounds. We combed the woods, but there was no sign of Katie. The only clue was that strange clearing days turned into weeks and the town began to lose hope. The Hammond were devastated, and it was all I could do to keep going. I spent my nights going over the case, trying to find something we'd missed, and then one night I found something. I was going through old records at the station when I stumbled across a file from the 1930s. It detailed a series of disappearances, all in the same area where Katie had vanished. Each case was eerily similar: a young girl last seen heading into the woods, never to be seen again, and in each case there was mention of a strange clearing with a circle of stones. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It sounded like something out of a ghost story, but the reports were real. I decided to pay a visit to the town historian, Mrs. Abernathy. She was a treasure trove of local lore, and might have some insight. Mrs. Abernathy lived in a rambling old house filled with books and artifacts. When I showed her the files, she nodded gravely. The woods have always had a dark history. She said there are legends of an ancient evil that dwells there, something that preys on the young and innocent. I was skeptical, but I couldn't ignore the similarities between the old cases and Katie's disappearance. Mrs. Abe mentioned a local legend about a creature known as the Watcher, said to lure people into the woods and trap them in another realm. It sounds like a fairy tale, I said, shaking my head. Maybe, she replied, but every legend has a grain of truth, with nothing else to go on. I decided to focus on the clearing. Joe and I went back, this time with a metal detector and some more sophisticated equipment. We found more pieces of fabric, some buttons, and what looked like an old rusted locket. Looks like it's been here a while, Joe said, examining. The locket inside was a faded photograph of a young girl. The style of dress suggested it was from the 1930s. Could be one of the girls from the old cases, I said, but how did it end up here? As we were packing up, I heard something, a faint whisper, like someone calling for help. I turned to Joe, but he was busy with the equipment. Did you hear that? I asked. Hear what? Someone's out there, I said, straining to listen. The whisper came again, clearer. This time it was Katie's voice. Help me, please. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the sound. Joe followed, a skeptical look on his face. We pushed through the underbrush. The whisper growing louder, more desperate. We reached another clearing smaller than the first. In the center stood a large, ancient tree. Its gnarled branches seemed to reach out like twisted arms. At the base of the tree, partially hidden by roots, was an old wooden door. What the hell is this? Joe muttered. I didn't have an answer. The door looked out of place, like something from a different time. The whispers were coming from behind it. We have to open it, I said, my heart pounding. Are you crazy? We don't know what's in there. Check in there, Joe. I can feel it. With a deep breath, I reached for the door. It was cold to the touch, and as I pulled it open, a rush of icy air hit us. Beyond the door was a staircase leading down into darkness. Stay close, I said, stepping inside. Joe followed reluctantly, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with a musty smell, like a long-forgotten basement. We descended slowly, the whispers growing louder. At the bottom of the stairs, we found a narrow corridor lined with old stone walls. It felt like we had stepped back in time into a place that shouldn't exist. As we moved forward, we saw a faint light ahead. It led to a small chamber, and in the center was Katie. She was huddled on the floor, her clothes torn, eyes wide with terror. Katie, I rushed to her side. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. They coming? She whispered. We have to leave now. Who's coming? Joe asked, scanning the chamber with his flashlight before she could answer. We heard footsteps behind us, slow, deliberate, echoing off the stone walls. We turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was tall, with elongated limbs and hollow black eyes. The Watcher, run! I shouted, pulling Katie to her feet. We bolted down the corridor. The creature's footsteps close behind. The air grew colder, and it felt like the walls were closing in on us. We reached the stairs and scrambled up, the creature's breath hot on our necks. As we burst through the door, I slammed it shut, the wood splintering under the force. We didn't stop running until we were back in the clearing, gasping for breath. I turned to see if the creature had followed us, but the woods were silent once more. We have to get out of here, Joe said, his face pale. This place isn't safe. We hurried back to town, Katie clinging to my arm. The Hammond were overjoyed to have her back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped entirely. Over the next few days I did some more digging. Mrs. Abe helped me research the history of the woods and the Watcher. We found references to similar entities in old European folklore creatures that existed on the edge of reality, feeding on fear. Katie recovered slowly, but she was never the same. The experience had changed. Her left her with a lingering fear that nothing could erase. As for me, I couldn't forget what I had seen. The rational part of me struggled to reconcile the events with my understanding of the world, but deep down I knew we had encountered something beyond explanation. The case was officially closed, but the legend of the Watcher continued to haunt me. I kept an eye on the woods, wary of any signs that the creature might return, and sometimes late at night I would hear whispers on the wind reminding me that some things are better left unexplained. I still don't believe in ghosts or monsters, not in the way most people do, but I've learned that there are things in this world that defy logic and reason, and in the quiet moments when the night is at its darkest, I remember the eyes of the Watcher and the terror in Katie's voice, and I wonder what else might be lurking in the shadows waiting to be discovered. I had been working as a police officer in Riddle Creek for about 5 years when things started to get weird. Riddle Creek wasn't a place anyone would recognize from the news or even a map if you weren't looking closely. It was a small town with a population just under 1,000, nestled deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. It was 1995 and the world was different back then. Quieter, slower. People didn't lock their doors and kids still played outside until the street lights came on. That all changed when the disappearances began. My name is Roy Bennett, and I grew up in Riddle Creek. Following in my old man's footsteps, I joined the police force right out of high school. It wasn't the kind of job you took to get rich. It was the kind you took because you cared about your neighbors. For the first few years the job was routine traffic tickets, the occasional bar fight, helping old Mrs. Jameson's cat out of a tree. But then, in the fall of '95, people started vanishing. The first to go missing was a young girl named Lily Thompson. She was just 10 years old, with curly blonde hair and a smile that could light up the darkest room. She had been playing in her backyard one evening, and then she was just gone. No signs of a struggle, no witnesses, nothing. It was like she had evaporated into thin air. Her parents were beside themselves and the entire town rallied together, searching the woods, the creek, every nook and cranny, but Lily was nowhere to be found. As days turned into weeks, hope dwindled, but we kept searching. I led most of the search parties, walking the dense forest until my legs felt like they'd give out. I didn't have kids of my own, but I felt the weight of the Thompson loss, as if Lily had been my own flesh and blood. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail in my mind, wondering what we had missed. A month later, another disappearance rocked our small community. This time it was Tom Weaver, a 30-year-old mechanic, known for his hearty laugh and generous spirit. He had been out for his usual morning jog and never returned. His wife Sarah reported him missing when he didn't come back for breakfast. Again we searched and again we found nothing. Rumors started to spread. Some folks whispered about wild animals, cougars, bears, though none had ever been seen near the town. Others talked about an old Native American legend of a forest spirit that took people away. As an officer, I couldn't put stock in stories, but the fear was palpable. People began locking their doors, keeping their kids inside. The sense of safety that had blanketed Riddle Creek for generations was unraveling. The turning point came with the third disappearance. Frank Carter, a retired school teacher, was last seen walking his dog along the creek's edge. His dog came back, but Frank didn't by this time. State police had joined the investigation, and even the FBI had taken an interest. They brought in experts, dogs, helicopters, the works, but like before, Frank had vanished without a trace. I remember the night. Clearly it was late November and the first snow of the season had begun to fall, blanketing the town in an eerie quiet. I was sitting in the station nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. When the phone rang, it was Sarah Weaver, Tom's wife. She was frantic, her voice trembling. "Roy, you need to come over now. I found something." I grabbed my coat and headed out into the cold. Sarah lived on the edge of town near the woods. When I arrived, she was waiting on the porch clutching a piece of paper. Her eyes were wide with fear. "What's going on, Sarah?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She handed me the paper. It was a note scrawled in Tomk handwriting. It read, "There in the woods. Don't look, don't follow." My blood ran cold. "Where did you find this?" "Under his pillow. I was changing the sheets and it just fell out." "What does it mean, Roy?" "I don't know, but we are going to find out." The note didn't make any sense. Tom had always been rational, grounded. Why would he write something like this, and why hide it? I called for backup, and soon my partner Jake arrived. We decided to head into the woods where Tom was last seen. Sarah's note was the only lead we had, and despite the growing darkness, we couldn't afford to wait. The snow crunched under our boots as we made our way through the trees, flashlights cutting through the night. "Roy, you think this has something to do with those other disappearances?" Jake asked, his breath visible in the cold air. "I don't know, but I've got a bad feeling about this," I replied, scanning the area. Hours passed with no sign of anything unusual. Just as we were about to turn back, Jake stumbled upon a small clearing. In the middle stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as we approached. The door creaked open, revealing a musty interior. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and dust danced in our flashlight beams. We split up, searching for any clues. In the back room I found a trap door half hidden under a threadbare rug. "Jake, over here," I called. He joined me and together we lifted the door. A rickety ladder led down into darkness. Taking a deep breath, I descended first, my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. The basement was damp and cold with a dirt floor. What I saw next made my heart pound in my chest. There were carvings on the walls, symbols and words in a language I didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a stone altar stained with something dark, and around it, scattered like discarded toys, were personal items: a child's shoe, a watch, a pair of glasses. "Jake, I think we found where they took them," I said, my voice shaking. "Jesus, Roy, what the hell happened here?" Jake replied, his face pale, before we could gather our thoughts. We heard a noise from above. The trapdoor slammed shut, and we were plunged into darkness. Panic set in as we scrambled to find a way out. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving us in pitch black. "Stay close, Jake," I whispered, feeling my way along the walls. "We need to find another way out." Hours felt like days as we groped in the dark. Just when hope was fading, I felt a breeze following it. We discovered a narrow tunnel leading out of the basement. Crawling through, we emerged into the forest, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. We were alive, but shaken to our core. Whatever was happening in Riddle Creek was far from over. We reported everything to our superiors, but they found nothing in the cabin or the basement. It was as if everything we had seen had been wiped away. The disappearances stopped after that, but the fear lingered. Sarah moved away, unable to bear the memories. The Thompsons eventually left too, seeking a fresh start elsewhere. Life in Riddle Creek slowly returned to normal, but the shadow of those missing people never left. Years passed and I stayed on the force, doing my best to protect our little town. But every time I walked those woods I felt a chill, remembering the night we found the cabin. I never figured out what happened to Lily, Tom, and Frank. Maybe I never will, but I can't shake the feeling that something still lurks out there in the shadows of Riddle Creek waiting, and so I keep my eyes open, my senses sharp, because some mysteries are never meant to be solved and some evils never truly disappear. The people of Riddle Creek may sleep soundly once more, but for me every rustle of leaves, every creak in the night, is a reminder that the past is never really gone. It's just waiting for the right moment to return. I had been a cop for about 8 years in a small, unremarkable town in the Midwest, the kind of place where the biggest excitement was the annual county fair and the occasional high school football game. My name is Daryl, and if you told me 10 years ago that I'd be recounting this story to you, I'd have laughed and told you to lay off the whiskey. It was late September 1987 when everything started to go sideways. I was on the night shift patrolling the outskirts of town, where nothing much happened, except for the occasional speeding teenager. It was around midnight when I got the call about a disturbance at the old Miller house, a decrepit building that had been abandoned for years. The dispatcher sounded unusually tense, which put me on edge immediately. The Miller house had a reputation among the locals. Kids would dare each other to spend the night there, and everyone had a story about hearing strange noises or seeing shadows in the windows. I never put much stock in ghost stories, but the place did give me the creeps. I pulled up to the house, shining my flashlight across the overgrown lawn and the rotting front porch. The moon was full, casting eerie shadows that danced in the light breeze. I radioed in my arrival and approached the front door, which was hanging on its hinges. "Hello, this is Officer Thompson. Is anyone here?" My voice echoed through the empty house. No response. Stepping inside, the wooden floorboards creaked under my weight. The air was stale and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. I swept my flashlight across the room, illuminating old furniture covered in white sheets. Like the ghosts of the past residents. I moved through the rooms, methodically checking for any signs of intruders. Everything seemed normal until I reached the basement door. It was slightly ajar, and a faint rhythmic thumping sound emanated from below grate. I muttered to myself, steeling my nerves. I pushed the door open and descended the rickety stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the thumping grew louder at the bottom. I found myself in a large unfinished basement. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing old storage boxes and discarded furniture in the far corner. I saw a wooden crate about the size of a coffin and the source of the noise. The lid was bouncing up and down, as if something inside was trying to get out. "Jesus," I whispered, drawing my service revolver. "Who's in there?" No answer. Just that relentless thumping. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. With one swift motion, I yanked the lid off and jumped back, ready to confront whatever was inside. To my astonishment, the crate was empty. I stood there dumbfounded as the thumping continued, now louder and more frantic. It was coming from beneath the crate. I moved the crate aside and discovered a trap door secured with a rusty padlock. The sound was deafening, now like a heartbeat reverberating through the floor. I aimed my flashlight at the lock and gave it a solid kick, breaking it open as I lifted the trappo. A foul stench hit me, causing me to gag. I shined my flashlight into the hole, revealing a narrow tunnel leading into darkness. The walls were lined with crude wooden beams and the floor was packed dirt. The thumping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence, swallowing my fear. I climbed down into the tunnel. It was just wide enough for me to crawl through on my hands and knees. The air was damp and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. I pressed on, determined to find the source of the disturbance. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a small chamber. My flashlight revealed a horrifying sight. Skeletal remains scattered across the dirt floor, some still clad in tattered clothing. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar covered in strange symbols that looked ancient and malevolent. On the altar lay a book. Its cover made of what looked like human skin. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I forced myself to approach. As I reached for the book, I heard a voice behind me, low and menacing. You shouldn't have come here, officer. I spun around my flashlight, illuminating a figure standing at the tunnel entrance. He was tall and gaunt with wild eyes and a crazed grin. His clothes were filthy and he clutched a large rusted knife. Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking the caretaker. He replied, his grin widening. This place is sacred. You've defiled it. Before I could react, he lunged at me. I fired my revolver, the shot echoing through the chamber. He stumbled, clutching his chest, but didn't go down with a guttural scream. He charged again, swinging the knife wildly. I dodged his attack and fired again, this time hitting him square in the head. He collapsed to the ground, the knife clattering away. I stood there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. I looked around the chamber at the bones and the altar and knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed the book and made my way back through the tunnel, my heart racing as I emerged from the basement. I radioed for backup. My voice barely steady. This is Officer Thompson. I need assistance at the Miller house. Possible homicide, send everyone. The next few hours were a blur. My colleagues arrived, securing the scene and calling in detectives and forensic teams. I was taken back to the station, where I gave my statement, still in shock from the night's events. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive in the town's history. The man I shot was identified as Harold Gibbons, a drifter with a history of mental illness. The book I found was an old grimoire filled with rituals and incantations that made my skin crawl. The bones in the chamber were identified as missing persons from the past 20 years, victims of a twisted cult that had used the Miller house as their base of operations. The altar was a place of dark rituals, and Harold had been the last of the cult's members left to guard their secrets. In the weeks that followed, I found it hard to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the chamber, the bones, and Harold's crazed grin. The town slowly returned to normal, but I knew things would never be the same for me. I eventually transferred to a different department, seeking a fresh start, but the memories of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of our quiet town. Looking back, I realize how close I came to becoming another victim, another set of bones in that chamber. I still keep the grimoire locked away, a grim memento of the horrors I uncovered. Life goes on, but some things are impossible to forget, and sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. I remember the year clearly. It was 1985. The town was tucked away in a corner of the Pacific Northwest, a place where everyone knew everyone and secrets didn't stay buried for long. My name is Owen Grant, and I've been with the police department for over a decade, patrolling the streets, keeping the peace. That year, though, it was different. It was the year that changed everything for me, for all of us. It started with a missing person report, which wasn't unusual. People would sometimes leave without notice, only to turn up a few days later sheepish and apologetic. But this time it was different. Jessica Fay, a high school junior, didn't come home after her part-time job at the diner. Her parents were frantic. Jessica was the kind of girl who called she was going to be 5 minutes late, let alone disappear without a trace. I got the call early in the morning. Mrs. Fay's voice trembled as she explained that Jessica never came home. My partner Max Holloway and I headed to the diner to start our investigation. The manager, a wiry man named Gus, was pacing outside. When we arrived, she left at her usual time, around 9:00 p.m. He said, wringing his hands. She always took the shortcut through the woods to get home. Max and I exchanged glances. The woods, they were dense, dark and easy to get lost in. If you didn't know your way, we decided to start there, hoping to find some clue, any clue about what happened to Jessica. As we walked through the woods, the morning light barely penetrated. The thick canopy above the air was heavy, with the scent of pine and damp earth. We called out her name, our voices echoing through the stillness. An hour passed, then two, and there was no sign of Jessica. My gut told me something was very wrong. We expanded our search, bringing in more officers and volunteers from the town. Days turned into a week and still nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The Fars were beside themselves with worry and the whole town was on edge. That's when we started hearing the rumors. The older folks in town spoke in hushed tones about the woods being cursed, about people disappearing over the years never to be found. I didn't put much stock in ghost stories, but I couldn't deny the eerie feeling that settled over me every time I stepped into those trees one evening. About 2 weeks into the search, I was sitting in the station going over the case files for the 100th time. When the phone rang, it was a local farmer, E.M.T. Hayes. He sounded shaken, saying he'd seen something strange in the woods near his property. "You got to come quick, Owen," he said, his voice cracking. "I saw someone out there. I think it might be Jessica." Max and I drove out to EMT's farm, our headlights cutting through the darkness. EMT met us at the gate, his face pale and eyes wide. "I saw her," he insisted. "She was standing at the edge of the woods just staring. When I called out to her, she ran back into the trees." We grabbed our flashlights and followed EMT to the spot where he'd seen her. The woods loomed before us, shadows dancing in the beam of our lights. We called out for Jessica, hoping against hope she'd answer, but the only response was the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Then we heard a faint cry like someone calling for help. My heart raced as we pushed deeper into the woods. Following the sound, the cries grew louder, more desperate, until we reached a small clearing. There at the center was Jessica. She was alive, but barely. Her clothes were torn and she was covered in dirt and scratches. She looked at us with wild eyes, her voice hoarse from screaming. "They are coming," she whispered. "They are coming for me." We got her out of there as fast as we could, taking her to the hospital. She was dehydrated and malnourished, but she would recover as she lay in the hospital bed. She told us what happened. Her story was almost too bizarre to believe. Jessica said she'd taken her usual route home that night, but felt like someone was watching her. She quickened her pace, but before she could reach the other side of the woods, something grabbed her. She described it as a man, but not quite. His eyes were all wrong and his skin was cold and clammy. He dragged her deeper into the woods to a place she'd never seen before, a place she called the Hollow. She managed to escape when he got distracted, but she'd been wandering the woods for days, lost and terrified, trying to find her way back. The doctors chalked it up to trauma and dehydration, but I believed her. There was something out there, something dangerous. The town tried to move on, but things were never quite the same. We increased patrols, warned people to stay out of the woods, but the sense of unease lingered. Then, a month later, another girl went missing. This time it was Emily Dodd, a freshman at the local college. The similarities were too striking to ignore. Max and I led the search again, this time with a sense of dread that was hard to shake. We combed the woods, but Emily was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks and, just like Jessica, it was as if she had vanished into thin air. The town was in a panic, parents keeping their kids close, everyone afraid to go out after dark. It was a few weeks after Emily disappeared that I got another call from EMT Hayes. He was more frantic than before, his words tumbling out in a rush. "She's back," he said. "Emily, she's in the woods." We raced to EMT's farm, my mind racing with fear and hope. When we arrived, EMT led us to the same spot where we'd found Jessica. This time Emily was there, but she was different. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes blank, her face expressionless. "Emily," I called out, stepping forward. "It's okay, you're safe now." She didn't respond. Just stared at me with those empty eyes. As I got closer, I realized she wasn't alone. There was someone behind her, a shadowy figure that sent a chill down my spine before I could react. Emily turned and ran, the figure following her into the trees. We chased out after them, the beam of our flashlights bouncing wildly. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees, a blow of darkness. I could hear Emily's footsteps ahead, but no matter how fast we ran, we couldn't catch up. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped. We burst into another clearing, but it was empty. Emily and the figure were gone. We searched the area, but there was no sign of them, no trace. They'd ever been there. Back at the station, we tried to piece together what had happened: Jessica's story, Emily's disappearance, the figure in the woods. It didn't make any sense, but one thing was clear: something was out there, something dangerous. As the months went by, the disappearances stopped, but the fear remained. People moved away, the town slowly emptying out. Max and I never gave up searching, always hoping for a break in the case, but it never came. Jessica moved away too, trying to put the nightmare behind her. Years passed and the town faded into obscurity, a place with too many dark memories. I stayed, though, unable to leave. The woods still called to me, a mystery. I couldn't solve a darkness I couldn't escape. I retired from the force eventually, but I never stopped searching. I'd walk the woods at night, flashlight in hand, hoping to find some clue, some answer. But the woods kept their secrets and the figure remained a shadow in my mind. One night, as I was walking the old path Jessica used to take, I felt that familiar sense of being watched. I turned and for a moment I saw him, the figure from the woods. He stood at the edge of the trees, his eyes gleaming in the darkness, and then he was gone, melting back into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, the memories flooding back, the fear, the unanswered questions. The woods were silent, but I knew the truth. Some mysteries were never meant to be solved, some darkness never banished, and so I walked back to town, the weight of years and unsolved cases heavy on my shoulders. The town was quiet, almost forgotten, but I would always remember the woods held their secrets, and somewhere in their depths the figure still watched, waiting. Life moved on, but the past lingered a shadow over my heart. I had given up hoping for answers. But sometimes, on those quiet nights when the wind whispered through the trees, I could still hear the faint cry for help, still feel the chill of those empty eyes watching from the darkness, the town, the woods, the missing girls. They were all a part of me now, a story that would never end, a nightmare that would never fade, and so I lived with the ghosts, the shadows and the unanswered questions, knowing that some horrors were too deep to ever be forgotten. I always believed that serving as a police officer in our small tucked-away town was as safe as jobs in law enforcement came. Nothing much happened around here, just the occasional bar fight, or a shoplifting case at the general store. My name is Jim Harron and I've been on the force for 20 years. What I'm about to tell you is the most harrowing experience of my career, an event that still haunts me today. It was a cold, rainy night in November 1995. I was working the night shift, partnered with my longtime friend and colleague Mike Dawson. We were sitting in the squad car sipping lukewarm coffee and trying to stay awake through the monotonous patrol. The rain pelted the windshield with a rhythmic drumming, lulling us into a false sense of security. The radio crackled to life, startling us both, all units. We've got a 1071 at the old mill house on Riverton Road, possible missing person reported by a neighbor. Mike and I exchanged puzzled looks. The old mill house had been abandoned for years. It was a relic from the town's industrial past, a decaying structure that loomed ominously on the outskirts. Why would anyone be there, especially on a night like this? We flipped on the sirens and sped towards Riverton Road. The journey was treacherous. The narrow, winding road slick with rain. By the time we arrived, the place looked as eerie as ever. The mill house, bathed in the dim glow of our headlights, appeared to stare back at us with hollow, empty windows. We got out of the car and surveyed the scene. No signs of anyone, just the relentless rain and the distant rumble of thunder. We approached the front door, our flashlights piercing through the darkness. The door creaked open, revealing a musty, damp interior. "Hello, police department." I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. No response, just the sound of rainwater dripping through the leaky roof. We split up to cover more ground. I took the first floor, while Mike headed upstairs. The place was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms and debris. Old machinery lay rusting in the corners, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. As I moved through the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind seemed amplified in the silence. I kept my flashlight moving, trying to catch any signs of life. Suddenly a faint noise caught my attention, a soft, almost imperceptible whimpering. I followed the sound to a room at the back of the building. The door was ajar and I could see a dim light flickering inside. I pushed the door open and froze. In the center of the room, surrounded by candles, was a young girl, no older than 12. She was tied to a chair, her eyes wide with fear. Her mouth was gagged and tears streamed down her face. "Hey, it's okay, I'm here to help," I whispered, approaching her slowly. She flinched, her eyes darting around the room. As I reached to untie her, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a man standing in the doorway, his face obscured by the shadows. He was holding a large knife. The blade glinting in the candle light. "Don't move." He growled, his voice low and menacing, "or she dies." My heart raced as I tried to beneath the surface. Life in our town eventually returned to normal, but the memory of that night at the mill house lingered. It became a cautionary tale, a story parents told their children to remind them to be vigilant, to be careful. For me, it was more than just a story. It was a turning point, a moment that forever changed my perspective on the world and my place in it. I continued to serve as a police officer, but with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of the hidden dangers that can exist in the shadows. Years later I retired from the force, but the memory of Emily in the mill house stayed with me. It was a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of always being prepared for the unexpected. Looking back, I realized that night had taught me more than I could have ever imagined. It showed me the depths of human obsession and the strength of the human spirit. It was a story of fear, survival and ultimately, hope, and it was a story I would never forget. Months had passed since the incident, but the nightmare still plagued me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jacob Thorne's face twisted with madness and desperation. I relived the struggle, the fight for control, and the moment I pulled the trigger, the image of Emily tied to that chair haunted my dreams. I tried to focus on my work, throwing myself into every case with renewed determination, but the memories lingered, a constant reminder of the darkness I had encountered. My colleagues noticed the change in me, but I brushed off their concerns, insisting I was fine. One evening, as I was finishing up some paperwork at the station, Mike approached my desk. "Jim, you got a minute?" I looked up, weary from a long day. "Sure, what's up?" He pulled up a chair and sat down, his expression serious. "I've been talking to the chief. We think it might be a good idea for you to take some time off, clear your head." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "Mike, I appreciate the concern, but I'm fine really." He shook his head. "No, Jim, you're not. We all saw what happened that night. It's okay to need a break." I knew he was right. The nightmares, the constant anxiety, it was all taking a toll on me. "All right, I'll think about it," I conceded. A week later I found myself packing a bag for a trip to the mountains. Mike had suggested a cabin. He knew of a secluded place where I could get some peace and quiet. It sounded perfect, a chance to escape the memories that haunted me. The drive to the cabin was long and winding, but the scenery was breathtaking. Tall pine trees lined the road, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the stuffy atmosphere of the mill house. I arrived just as the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace and a large porch overlooking a tranquil lake. I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I stepped inside, setting my bag down on the wooden floor. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I spent my mornings fishing on the lake, my afternoons hiking through the woods, and my evenings reading by the fire. The solitude was soothing, a welcome break from the chaos of my daily life. But even in this peaceful setting, the memories of that night persisted. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch watching the stars twinkle in the clear night sky, I heard a noise behind me. I turned my hand, instinctively reaching for the gun I no longer carried there. Standing at the edge of the porch was a man. He was tall and thin, with a wild look in his eyes. For a moment, I thought I was seeing Jacob Thorne again, but as the man stepped into the light, I realized he was a stranger. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steady, despite the fear that gripped me. The man smiled, a chilling expression that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm just a traveler looking for some company." I stood, my heart pounding in my chest. "You need to leave now." He took a step closer, his smile never faltering. "I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, I have unfinished business here." I backed away, my mind racing. "What do you want?" The man's smile widened. "I want what's mine, and I won't leave until I get it." In that moment I realized he wasn't just a random stranger. He was connected to Thorne, to the horrors of that night, and he was here to finish what Thorne had started. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me. I grabbed my phone, dialing Mike's number with shaking hands. "Mike? It's Jim. I need help. There's a man here at the cabin. He's dangerous." Mike's voice was calm and reassuring. "Hang tight, Jim. I'm on my way." I barricaded the door, my mind racing. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself. All I could do was wait and hope Mike arrived in time. The minutes felt like hours as I sat in the dark listening for any sign of the intruder. Finally, I heard the sound of a car approaching, followed by footsteps on the porch. "Jim, it's Mike, open up." I rushed to the door, pulling it open. Mike stood there, his gun drawn, his eyes scanning the area. "Where is he?" I shook my head. "I don't know, he was here, but he disappeared." Mike stepped inside, his expression serious. "We need to find him. He could be hiding nearby." We searched the area, but there was no sign of the man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Mike stayed with me that night, keeping watch while I tried to get some rest. The next morning we filed a report and headed back to town. The incident was investigated, but no leads were found. The man remained a mystery, his connection to Thorne a chilling reminder of the darkness that still lingered. I returned to work, but the fear never truly left me. I was more vigilant, more cautious, always looking over my shoulder. The experience had changed me, made me realize that the horrors of that night were not confined to the moors. Years later, as I reflect on those events, I understand that some scars never fully heal the memories of that night. The fear and uncertainty are a part of me now, but I also know that I am stronger for having faced them, and that I will always carry the lessons I learned with me. In the end, it's not just about the darkness we encounter, but how we choose to confront it, and while the memories may never fade, neither will the strength and resilience that come from surviving the unimaginable. It was a grey, overcast day in late October, the kind that makes you want to stay indoors with a cup of coffee and a good book. But I had a job to do. My name's Eddie Parker, and I've been a police officer in this small backwoods town for going on 20 years. You see some strange things in this line of work, but what happened that fall was something I'll never forget. I was sitting at my desk in the station, sifting through the usual paperwork, when the call came in missing persons case. I'd handled my fair share, but there was something different about this one. A young woman named Laura Shepherd had disappeared from her home the night before her husband. Tom was frantic. Tom was a burly man with a deep voice that shook when he spoke. She wouldn't just leave like this. Eddie? Something's wrong, he said, wringing his hands. I'd known Tom for years and he wasn't the type to panic. This made me uneasy. I drove out to their place, a modest house on the edge of town, the kind of place where the woods press in on all sides, making you feel like you're on the edge of the world. Tom met me at the door, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She was here last night. He started leading me inside. We had dinner, watched some TV. She went to bed before me. I stayed up to finish some work. When I came to bed she was gone, just gone. I nodded, taking notes. The house was neat, nothing out of place. Her purse was still on the kitchen table, her car keys hanging by the door. It didn't look like she'd planned to leave. I asked Tom if they'd had any fights recently. Any reason she might have taken off. No, nothing like that. He insisted. We've been happy. She's been happy. I walked through the house looking for any signs of a struggle or forced entry, but found none. I stepped into their bedroom, a small cozy room with a quilt on the bed and family photos on the walls. That's when I noticed the window. It was open just a crack, but enough to let in the cold night air. Was this window open when you found she was gone? I asked. Tom shook his head. I don't know. I don't think so. I'd have noticed if it was. I peered out the window, into the thick woods that surrounded their home. Something about the darkness out there felt off, like it was watching me. I shook the feeling off. I had a job to do. Okay, Tom. I said, turning back to him. We'll start a search. Check the woods, talk to the neighbors. We'll find her. The next few days were a blur of search parties and interviews. We combed the woods, knocking on doors, but no one had seen anything. It was like Laura had vanished into thin air. The townsfolk started to whisper, talking about old legends and ghost stories, but I didn't. Rustling of leaves in the breeze. I found myself walking towards the woods near Laura's house. Something was pulling me there, a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. I stood at the edge of the trees, staring into the darkness. It felt alive, like it was breathing. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The air was colder here and the silence was oppressive. I walked deeper, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the trees. Then I heard it. A whisper so faint I thought I imagined it. I stopped, straining to hear the whisper. Came again, a soft, chilling sound. I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest. I came to a clearing, and there she was, an old woman, just as Laura had described. Her hair was wild, her eyes gleaming in the moonlight. She was chanting, her hands raised to the sky. Around her were more symbols carved into the ground. Who are you? I called out, my voice steady, despite the fear gripping me. She turned to me, her eyes piercing. You should not be here, she said in a voice that sent chills down my spine. This place is not for you. What did you do to Laura? To the others? She smiled, a cold, cruel smile. They belong to the woods. Now, as you will. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my head, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back at the station, lying on the floor of my office. My head was pounding and I had no idea how I got there. I looked around, disoriented. My desk was a mess. Papers scattered everywhere. I stood up slowly, trying to piece together what had happened. The last thing I remembered was the old woman in the woods. Had it been a dream? No, it felt too real. I checked my watch. It was morning. I had lost the entire night. I needed answers and I needed them fast. I called my friend at the state police again, told him everything. He was skeptical, but he agreed to send a team down to investigate. In the meantime, I had to keep looking. Laura was safe for now, but I had a feeling this wasn't over. I decided to visit the local library, see if I could find anything about the symbols or the old legends. The librarian, Mrs. Jenkins, was a kind old woman who had lived in the town her whole life. If anyone knew about the history of this place, it was her. "Eddie, what brings you here?" she asked, smiling as I walked in. "I'm looking for information on some old symbols. Maybe something related to the occult," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Her smile faded. "Why would you want to know about that?" "I'm working on a case, found some strange markings, and I need to understand what they mean." She nodded slowly, leading me to a back room filled with old books and dusty files. "This town has a dark history. Eddie, there are things better left alone. I need to know, Mrs. Jenkins." She sighed, pulling out a large leather-bound book. "This might help. It's a collection of old stories and legends from the area. Be careful with it." I took the book, thanking her, and sat down at a table. The book was filled with stories of witches and curses, strange creatures that lurked in the woods. I found a section on the symbols and my blood ran cold. They were ancient, used in rituals to summon dark forces. I spent hours reading, trying to piece together the puzzle. The more I read, the more I realized we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This was something much darker, something that had been lurking in the shadows of our town for centuries. As I closed the book, my phone rang. It was Tom. "Eddie, you need to come quick. It's Laura. She's gone again." I raced over to their house, my heart pounding. Tom met me at the door, his face pale and drawn. "She was here this morning, but she went out to get some air. I thought she'd just gone for a walk, but she didn't come back." I searched the house hoping to find some clue, but there was nothing, just an eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air. I stepped outside, looking towards the woods. I had a feeling that's where she'd gone, where she'd been taken. I called in backup, forming another search party. We combed the woods, calling out her name, but there was no sign of her. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and turn. Then we heard a scream, a blood-curdling scream that sent chills down my spine. We ran towards the sound, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. We found her in the same clearing where I'd seen the old woman. Laura was lying on the ground, her eyes wide with terror. She was alive, but barely. I knelt beside her, checking for injuries. She was cold. Her skin pale as death. "We need to get her to a hospital," I said, my voice shaking, as we carried her out of the woods. I looked back, half expecting to see the old woman watching us, but there was nothing, just the dark, silent trees at the hospital. The doctor said she was in shock, but she'd survive. I stayed by her side, hoping she'd wake up and tell us what happened, but she remained silent, her eyes staring blankly ahead. I knew then that this wasn't over. Whatever was out there, it was still waiting, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. As I sat by Laura's bed, I made a promise to myself. I was going to find out what was happening in those woods. I was going to stop it, whatever it took, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that we were up against something far more powerful than we could ever imagine. I was fresh out of the academy, a wide-eyed rookie with a shiny badge and an old beat-up cruiser to match. My first assignment was a small town tucked away in the rolling hills, a place where nothing much ever happened. Also, I thought the town had that typical charm: a main street with a diner, a barber shop, and a general store. Everyone knew everyone, and outsiders were few and far between. It was late summer, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and the sound of seekers. I was on night patrol, getting to know the lay of the land when the call came in. Officer Mitchell, you copy? The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. Copy that, dispatch. What's the situation? I replied, adjusting the radio on my belt. We've got a report of a missing person up at the old Miller farm. Neighbors said they saw something strange. I felt a twinge of excitement, my first real case. I hit the lights and headed out the blue and red reflecting off the trees as I sped down the dark road. The Miller farm was a relic from another era, with its peeling paint and overgrown fields. As I pulled up the gravel drive, the headlights caught the silhouette of Mrs. Dawson, the neighbor who'd called it in. She was a wiry woman in her 70s, clutching a shawl around her shoulders, despite the warmth evening. I'm Officer Mitchell, can you tell me what you saw? Her eyes were wide, darting between me and the darkened farmhouse. It was late, maybe around 10 p.m. I saw a light moving in the old barn. Ain't nobody been in there for years. Then, just before midnight, I heard a scream. It was short, but it chilled me to the bone. I nodded, trying to reassure her. All right, Mrs. Dawson, I'll check it out. You head back home and lock your doors, just in case. She didn't need to be told twice. As she hurried back to her house, I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the barn. The night was still too still, and I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. The old barn loomed ahead, its doors hanging askew. I pushed them open, the hinges creaking in protest. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing dust motes dancing in the air. The barn was empty, save for a few rusty tools and bales of hay. I was about to turn back when I noticed something glinting in the corner. Kneeling down, I found an old locket. Its chain broken inside was a picture of a young woman, her eyes hauntingly familiar. I pocketed the locket and decided to check the farmhouse next. The door was unlocked, swinging open with a push. The interior was just as abandoned as the barn, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling and furniture covered in sheets. As I moved through the rooms, the floorboards creaked under my weight, echoing in the emptiness. In the kitchen, I found a table set for one, dust-free, unlike the rest of the house. Whoever had been here had cleaned it. Recently, my gut told me something wasn't right. I was about to call it in when I heard a faint rustling from upstairs. Drawing my gun, I crept up the narrow staircase, every step a reminder of how alone I was out here. The sound grew louder, coming from a room at the end of the hall. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the window was open, curtains billowing in the breeze. Outside, I saw a figure moving towards the woods. I didn't think I just acted, racing back down. I burst out of the house and sprinted toward the trees, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The woods were dense, the trees closing in around me. I followed the sounds of snapping branches and heavy breathing, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly the trail went cold. I stopped listening, straining to hear anything over my own ragged breaths. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw a figure standing motionless in the shadows. My flashlight revealed a man, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "Stop, police!" I shouted, aiming my gun at him. He didn't move, didn't even flinch, just stared at me with those unnerving eyes. I took a step closer and he bolted, disappearing deeper into the woods. I gave chase, the underbrush tearing at my uniform, my lungs burning. I don't know how long I ran before I lost him completely. I stood there panting, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. I knew I should head back, but something kept me there, a nagging feeling that I was missing something. Then I saw a cabin hidden among the trees. It was old, but there were signs of recent use. I approached cautiously, the flashlight illuminating the path. The door was ajar and I pushed it open with my footgun at the ready. The interior was a stark contrast to the farmhouse. It was lived in, with food on the table and a fire burning in the hearth on the wall. I saw photos, dozens of them, all of the same woman from the locket. She was everywhere smiling, laughing, but in the last few she looked scared. I heard a noise behind me and spun around, gun raised. There stood the man blocking the doorway up close. I could see the madness in his eyes, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and menacing. I kept my gun trained on him. "Who are you? Where's the woman from the photos?" His smile widened. "She's here, officer. She's always been here." Before I could react, he lunged at me and we grappled, knocking over furniture in the small space. He was stronger than he looked and I struggled to keep hold of my gun. We crashed into the table and I felt a sharp pain, as something hard connected with my head. Dazed, I managed to push him off and staggered to my feet. He was on me again in an instant, but this time I was ready. I slammed the butt of my gun into his temple and he crumpled to the floor unconscious, gasping for breath. I secured his hands with my cuffs and called for backup. As I waited, I searched the cabin hoping to find some clue about the woman. In a back room I found a trap door leading to a cellar. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. I climbed down the flashlight, cutting through the darkness. The cellar was small, with shelves lined with jars of preserved food. In the corner I saw a figure huddled against the wall. It was the woman from the photos. Her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," I said softly, lowering my gun. "I'm here to help." She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with those haunted eyes. I reached out a hand and she flinched, but slowly she took it. Her hand was cold and I could see the bruises on her wrists. "Let him get you out of here," I said, guiding her towards the ladder. As we emerged into the cabin, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Backup was finally here. I let her outside the cool night air, a welcome relief. After the stifling cellar, the other officers arrived and I filled them in on what had happened. They took the man into custody and tended to the woman, who still hadn't spoken a word. I watched as they loaded her into the ambulance, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. I stayed behind to secure the scene, my mind racing with questions. Who was the man? Why had he kept her here, and what had driven him to such madness? As I stood there, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees, I knew this was only the beginning. There were answers to be found and I was determined to uncover them. No matter where the trail led, I headed back to my cruiser, the weight of the night's events settling on my shoulders. This quiet town had secrets, dark ones, and it was up to me to bring them to light. As I drove back towards the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the eyes of the man in the woods were still on me, waiting for the next move. But that was a worry for another day. For now I had a report to write and a mystery to solve. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but I was ready for whatever came next. When I started on the force in our quiet town nestled in the thick woods of upstate New York, I never imagined my days would be anything but routine. Sure, there were the occasional bar fights, the odd domestic disturbance and the teenage antics on Friday nights, but mostly it was peaceful. That all changed in the fall of 1987, the year of the disappearances. I remember that first chilly September morning, like it was yesterday. I was sitting in the squad car, the radio crackling with status, as I sipped my coffee. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the town in reds and golds. It was the kind of morning that made you grateful to be alive. The call came in around 8:00 a.m. A local farmer, George Matthews, had reported his daughter missing. Emily Matthews, 17, was supposed to catch the bus to school, but never showed. George had found her backpack by the side of the road, just a few hundred yards from their farmhouse. I drove out to the Matthews place trying to piece together the situation. Emily was a good kid, by all accounts straight. A student, played the flute in the school band, never got into trouble, the kind of girl who wouldn't just run off. When I pulled up to the farmhouse, George was pacing the front porch, his face pale and drawn. Mrs. Matthews was inside crying softly into a handkerchief. They showed me Emily's room neat as a pin. Nothing out of place, no signs of a struggle, no note, nothing. We searched the area, the fields, the woods nearby, but found no trace of Emily. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Emily's face etched in my mind. I had a bad feeling in my gut, the kind you can't shake off. The next week another call came in. Another teenager, this time a boy named Ricky Johnson, went missing. Same story supposed to catch. The bus never showed. His bike was found by the side of the road, but no sign of Ricky. 2 kids in 2 weeks. It was too much to be a coincidence. The town was on edge. Parents started driving their kids to school, keeping them indoors after dark. Everyone was looking over their shoulders, whispering about who or what could be behind the disappearances. Theories ran wild. Some said it was a serial killer, others thought it was a cult, and a few even whispered about something more sinister, something not entirely human. A few days later I was assigned to a night patrol. The woods around our town were thick, dark and full of shadows. It was the kind of place where the trees seemed to close in around you, where every rustle and crack made your heart skip a beat. As I drove through the winding roads, my headlights slicing through the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight I pulled over near the old Miller place, a farmhouse that had been abandoned for years. Kids used to dare each other to spend the night there, but nobody ever did. I decided to take a look around, see if I could find anything that might give us a clue. The house loomed over me, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. The door creaked as I pushed it open and I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the thick dust. The air was stale and the floorboards groaned under my weight. I moved slowly, my hand on my holster, every nerve on edge. I checked the first floor, then made my way upstairs. The hallway was narrow, lined with doors on either side. As I approached the last door on the right, I heard a faint noise, a shuffling sound, like someone moving inside. I drew my gun, my heart pounding in my chest, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, just a small window letting in a sliver of moonlight. But then I saw it, a trapdoor in the floor slightly ajar. I crouched down, shining my flashlight into the darkness below. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. I climbed down the ladder, my boots hitting the dirt floor with a dull thud. The space was cramped, the air thick with decay. I moved forward my flashlight, revealing a small makeshift room, and there in the corner, I saw them, Emily and Ricky, bound and gagged, their eyes wide with fear. They were alive, thank God, but barely. I called for backup, my voice shaking as I reassured them that they were safe. Now? As I waited for the other officers to arrive, I looked around the room trying to make sense of it all. There were strange symbols carved into the walls, a collection of old books and jars filled with God knows what it was like, something out of a nightmare. When the others arrived, we got the kids out of there and called in a team to investigate the scene, the symbols, the books. It all pointed to something dark, something beyond our understanding. But for now our priority was getting Emily and Ricky to safety. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief when the kids were found, but the questions lingered. Who had taken them and why? As the weeks passed, more details came to light. The Miller place had been used by a group that dabbled in the occult, a cult of sorts. They believed in summoning dark forces using human sacrifices to gain power. It was the stuff of horror movies, but it was all too real. We arrested a few suspects, but the leader, the one they called the Dark Priest, was still out there. The kids' testimonies were harrowing. They spoke of rituals, of chanting in languages they didn't understand, of seeing things that defied explanation. They had been chosen. The cult believed for their purity, their innocence. The case consumed me. I couldn't let it go. I spent every waking moment trying to track down the dark priest to put an end to the madness. The trail led me to an old abandoned church on the outskirts of town. It was a place shrouded in darkness, a place that seemed to pulse with malevolence. I went there alone one night determined to find answers. The church was in ruins. Its stained glass windows shattered, the pews rotting away. I moved cautiously, my flashlight flickering as I made my way to the altar. That's when I heard a low guttural chant echoing through the halls. I followed the sound, my heart in my throat. It led me to the basement, to a room hidden behind a false wall. There, in the dim light, I saw him, the dark priest, his face hidden beneath a hood, his hands raised in invocation. He didn't seem surprised to see me, as if he had been expecting this confrontation. "You're too late," he said, his voice a cold whisper. "The ritual is complete. The darkness has been awakened." I didn't hesitate. I fired the shot, echoing like thunder in the confined space. The dark priest fell, his chant dying on his lips, but even as he lay there, a smile curled on his face, as if he knew something I didn't. The room began to shake, the walls, trembling as if the very foundation of the church was coming apart. I turned to run, but something stopped me. A presence, a force that seemed to reach out and hold me in place. The air grew cold and a sense of dread washed over me. I don't remember how I got out of there, how I made it back to my car. The church collapsed behind me, a cloud of dust rising into the night sky, but the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of perception, stayed with me. The town tried to move on, but things were never quite the same. The disappearances stopped, but the scars remained. People looked at each other with suspicion, wondering if the darkness still lingered among them. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the dark priest had succeeded in summoning something that was still out there waiting. I left the force a few years later, unable to bear the weight of those memories, but I kept searching, kept looking for answers, hoping that one day I'd find a way to banish the darkness for good. And so I find myself here in this small cabin on the edge of the woods, my only companions the ghosts of the past. The night is dark and still the only sound, the wind rustling through the trees. But I know deep down that the fight isn't over, that something is still out there watching, waiting for its chance to return. And when it does, I'll be ready. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and share it with your friends. Together, let's explore more mysteries.